Okay, we're back with another 40k Tactics video. This one will be fun because it's going to make everyone grumpy. We're going to talk about who lost you the game.
I don't like to make everyone grumpy, but it's more about pointing out that there's grump involved. No one likes being called out. But we're gonna hit everybody, not just any person, like all the people. So
yeah, here we go. All right.
So one of the biggest things to getting better at this game, but also understanding what it is like you could do better or what mistakes you made, etc., is this after action report. I constantly encourage people of like, set aside time after the game, unless you're at like a tournament or something, but like try to specifically ask like yourself and your opponent what you could have done better, what choices were made that maybe weren't the best. Did I waste CP? Did I not use it early enough? Did I, charge the wrong thing, make the wrong target priority? This sort of deciding at the end of the game in an objective way, not like a grumpy way, like I lost and this sucks, but more like a whether you win or lose doesn't matter, what could I have done better, will help you become a better player infinitely compared to almost anything else you do. So whether that's talking over lists, which should happen at the beginning, but also kind of at the end, it's the, asking, hey, what do you think was kind of wasted in my list? What do you think was like really good? What, went really well this game? And specifically understanding, and I'll probably touch on this again, but understanding that when you ask your opponent about your list or your choices or whatever, that is through the lens of what they're playing, right? So if I'm playing my Necrons into a Custodes matchup and I say, hey, what do you think about the Lich Guard? Well, if they say the Lich Guard were awful, that's through the lens of a Custodes player, right? I could take those same Lich Guard and put them against, let's say, Guardsmen, and they'll say, holy crap, they were unkillable, they're the best thing in your list. Whenever you ask your opponent, it's not that you shouldn't listen to them, because you should, but you have to take all that information and filter it so that if it's like, okay, I asked like 6 different players and they all said the, Wraith or whatever were trash, why did you bring them? Okay, I should probably drop them. But if 2 out of 6 players said they weren't very good, well, maybe it's not that they're bad, maybe it's that they're not good in those matchups and I should play them differently in those matchups, but they're worth staying in the list. That's kind of a big thing of after action reports are really important, but you have to get a bunch of them and then filter them to actually get good information out of them.
You need the number of games, because there's so much variation in the game between what you're fighting against, what the missions are, what the layout is even.
And how that player decides to use their codex. Because again, you could be playing a guard list this time, and it's totally different the next time you play it, because it's like artillery park, and then the next one has no artillery, and so like even within a single faction, there could be wild differences as far as how you're supposed to play and how your list matches up to them.
It's annoying. Well, we can fix that, but it's fine. Okay.
So a lot of times, and this is not everybody, obviously, but there are times where people blame GW. They'll say, my faction's trash right now, or, holy crap, your unit's way undercosted, and they'll try to blame GW. Obviously, there are times where it feels that way, and some of that might be a matchup specific thing, right? Like, that unit is designed to kill hordes. So as an orc player, you're like, that unit's way undercosted, it's nuts. But it turns out if they go into matchups with that same unit at the same point cost against like really tough things, like let's say a bunch of Zatan or Knights or something like that, well, now the unit feels like a complete waste, and why did they take it at all? So again, you have to filter this through the lens of, but what are you playing against? You can't just play one game and decide that you figured out like it's undercosted or overcosted or whatever.
Because they're all dependent on the situation.
Correct.
So points and abilities are not always clear.
Especially when you consider how specialized a lot of units are. Because like Space Marines is a great example, but this applies to almost every faction. You can have a unit that's wholly dedicated to horde busting, like the Infernus Flamer guys, or you could have something that's wholly dedicated to tank busting, like the Eradicator Melta guys. So to say that like, this Melta unit feels terrible because you were playing against orcs, and it turns out it's really easy to kill trucks, you didn't need dedicated tank busting. But then you play that again, against knights, and you're like, why did I even take flamers? There's not even a valid target for them. All of these are true in that matchup, but that doesn't mean that it's worth taking out of your list or saying that they're over or undercosted. So the short answer here is blaming GW, well, sometimes is true, right? Like there's clearly times where like beginning of the edition, there was some Eldar nonsense that was like, okay, way 20% higher plus, win rate than everyone else. Holy crap, they're clearly the best thing by like a big margin. It was a GW mistake. But everyone agreed, even like the Eldar player, right? Whereas now things are way more balanced. We've worked out a lot of those egregious mistakes. So now saying that like this unit's overcosted or undercosted is way harder to argue because it's so matchup dependent.
Yeah, I would argue it's even whether you go first or second dependent. Sometimes.
Sometimes, and I think
it depends on the list builds too. A lot of that you could argue is the fault of the player and how they deploy, but
correct, and that would be the argument I make, because there's plenty of times where we've even done it in the store where someone will deploy as if they're going first and they'll get punished for it when they go second, but then I will literally ask to borrow their list, play their list in a different way to where my deployment's a little different, things like that. And then whether I go first or second, I can point out how I'm in a good defensive position. So for the most part, go first does give you a lot of advantages. However, if you deploy right and plan for what if I go first, what if I go second in a good way, I think you can mitigate a good amount of that. Maybe not all of it, but a fair amount.
Now, all that being said, there definitely are units that are overcosted or undercosted.
Sure, absolutely.
Planes are totally overcosted, even if we assume you can deploy them, which I still don't see rules as written. But to be specific, aircraft. But
yeah,
there's not a lot of fixing that right now. Tank busters are just straight math garbage.
Correct.
There's no saving grace. They're still too expensive.
Well, when you get your new kit, we'll see if that's still true. But
yeah, Kill Team will save us all. All right. What about how your opponent played? We kind of touched on it, but was it like their scoring or a certain part of their scoring?
Yep. And again, this kind of goes to what kind of list did they play? Because playing against a Necron player that's like, taking a bunch of Satan and has almost no scoring units, you would have to play against them differently than if they were running no Satan and running horde style, just, infinite scoring. Like, did the mission allow them to, like battle line, to do actions when they weren't supposed to, that sort of thing. Some of this is on your opponent, right? Like, did they overexpose themselves? Did you capitalize at the right time? Things like that. But it kind of goes both ways in that when your opponent played that way, did you respond appropriately? So maybe they were playing bad and the game felt easy. So it's not that you have a good matchup against that faction, it's that your opponent made a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, so I want to add that we keep mentioning like the list, but let's assume that for competitive play, you're going to put tools in your list to score secondaries and stand on circles for primary. If that's the case, and both players do that, then it's about how you both use those tools to accomplish that.
Mm-hmm.
If you play a list that doesn't have those things, of course you're going to do poorly because you can't score any points. You're just like severely disadvantaged in trying to score points, which that's more of a narrative fun style play. It's totally fine. If you're trying to be competitive, you have to take into account, you have to be able to do actions.
And to be clear, every faction, everyone, period, has access to all of the tools that are technically required to win. Now, maybe that means you're playing Chaos Knights and you need to ally in some like demons or something like that, see some cheap objective grabbers or outflankers, something like that. But whether you have to ally in or not, or whether you just have to play a unit that you think doesn't look cool or something like that, technically everyone has access to all of the tools that they need to win. This is so clearly shown by, if you look at tournament results, first place is almost randomized. Like if you weren't there at the game, you don't know who it is. Watching the different factions get first place, like Death Guard just last week got a first place. Tau got a first place last week. There was an AdMech that got second. There was like, it almost seems completely random. There's no clear, hey, right now Eldar are on top, or right now Necrons are winning, or like, everyone has access to all the tools they need. It may not be the ones they want to play because they've got some bias towards, I don't like the way Vespids look, or I don't like which is, everybody loves the way new Vespids look, but yeah, you all have access to all the tools you need if you're willing to use them or know how to use them.
Okay, what was it? How you played? So again, I mean, we mentioned this. Did your deployment plan for going second? You should basically always plan for that because you have no control over who's going first.
Mm-hmm. And you can deploy certain units, like just whole hog, I need to go first or they die. It's okay to do that with some of your list, but if you end up doing that with the majority of your list, all you're doing is giving your opponent like the best target priority and they pick apart your list, right? Beyond this, there are plenty of other things than just deployment. Obviously, did you prioritize during your play going after secondaries or primaries, or, did you have proper target priority by removing the things that could deal with your end game, units? There's a whole lot to it. It's not just deployment, but as I've said before, deployment is the biggest part of doing well.
Okay, so going back to that, what is this? This is a big one, which is how long have you played the list? I highly recommend people don't change their lists like after 2 games.
It's a thing that a lot of people struggle with because, I mean, we've seen it in the store, right? Like someone comes in, they're like, oh, I made some changes to my list. I think this is going to be better. And then after they added some horde busting to their list, they go against Custodes, which are not horde. And then they have a hard time. And they're like, I guess that was a mistake. And then they go back. It's like, but you didn't even test it into the thing that you were trying to deal with. Like, you lost to orcs, you added horde busting. After you added horde busting, you played Custodes or Knights, and then you were like, the horde busting didn't do anything, and then you got rid of it. That's not the matchup you put it in for. So I'm not saying that you should like, oh, I added horde busting, I should go find a horde list to make myself feel better because look how well it did. But you don't want to something, make an adjustment to your list or make a new list for that matter. Play it once or twice. Say, well, I've only played against like Knights and Custodes, the 2 tough factions, and then decided that the list isn't good. Well, it's like, well, what if it's good against all the other factions and just Knights and Custodes given your build are your bad matchups, and you need to stop worrying about killing and worry about scoring and things like that. You're not going to figure that out in 2 games.
Yeah. And honestly, the same can be said for jumping factions a lot too. Which more of the experienced players have 2 or 3 factions. That's normal, just over time. But it's that you really have to put some time into getting to know not only your list, but also the faction in general. If you're constantly jumping around, you never get to know the unit's advantages and disadvantages, so that in competitive play, oh, I can't really flex that into this, but I can flex it towards this type of unit and do okay. Because you're not given the best matchups, like unit type wise. It's those middling decisions that are harder to make that you only get with more experience. I would argue, I always bring them up, but the Super Grots are very weird because they're so fragile. They can't kill anything. They're OC2, and they like move 12 and scout 9. So the whole point is just they can't hold an objective for like until my opponent's end of next turn or my next command phase for those secondaries, but they can totally stop an opponent from holding the objective because their OC is so high and they have so many wounds to chew through. You have to kind of understand what they can get used for.
So going back slightly, I'll actually take that a step further. Like if you have multiple factions and you jump back and forth, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I would actually argue that's good because you're seeing like different play styles and that will help you with your main faction. But in jumping back and forth, even if you've played, let's say you've played guards so much that you know them in and out, but then you switched over and played sisters for a while or played Tau for a while or whatever, because we have a player like that. Going back to guard, even though you know them in and out, because you haven't played them in a while, how likely is it that you're going to make a mistake or forget? It's not that you didn't know the right matchup or target priority, but it's just you haven't played them in so long, like you didn't think about it till after you declared targets. Oh, I should have done that differently. Like, if you were wanting to get better, on factions, things like that, doing all these things is good in the long term. But if you're like, I want to win this tournament next month, in the short term, you have to like focus in on something. You can't just say, oh, I'm gaining experience, and long term that's good. Somehow that's going to make me better at this thing next week. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. So what are you blaming?
I am blaming me all the time. And there's an argument for that's why I am constantly progressing. But I have to clarify that when I blame myself, I am not saying like, oh, I'm terrible. It's that, oh, I could have done this better. I'm constantly accepting that I make mistakes, and it's okay if I make mistakes, but it's about incrementally doing like one thing better every time. And yes, that means I got to get in like 1,000 games to make the kind of strides that I want to make, but I'm okay with that. What I'm not blaming, which is the better question, is I'm not blaming GW. I'm not blaming, I think this rule's broken, or they need to update this rule, or where's my FAQ. I'm not asking for GW to change my points. I would love if they changed my points. Holy cow, would that be great. But not like saying my faction's unplayable until they do it. I'm saying, okay, given the points, given the tools that I have right now via rules or points or whatever, I know I can win. I know I can win, period. But it's about, am I putting in the time and effort? Am I working to get better in order to make that a true statement?
Yeah, it's just about working around the tools you have. You can blame all kinds of things all day long, but if you can't change those things, it doesn't really matter. The things you can change is how you play and what you put in your list, and that's basically it.
Yep.
Just like if your opponent is a big jerk at a tournament or whatever, there's only so many things you can do.
Yep. And all of that is up to you. If your opponent's a jerk, getting angry and being a jerk back doesn't help you. Objectively, getting angry means that you're going to make more mistakes. That is a negative. That may be their plan even. They may be a jerk naturally, or they may see that you're hot-headed and then are more of a jerk for the sole purpose of convincing you to make more mistakes. But everything's within your control. If they're being a jerk, call the judge more. If they're being a jerk, just stay calm, let them be a jerk, and when it doesn't faze you, you still look calm. They start making more mistakes because they thought it would faze you and it doesn't. The one other thing I wanted to touch on is specifically your opponent's list. the one thing you cannot blame is your opponent's list. You can't say, well, their list is so much better than mine right now, or their points just went down, so they went down too far, or they're playing some cheesy meta thing. None of that exists right now. Objectively, I'm going to say it. My actual opinion is there is no meta list. There are things that show up a little more. There are things that are arguably closer to meta, but the top 10 tables at every GT are so wildly different, from within the same faction to what factions are there. I don't actually know that there is a meta.
Yeah, I think every faction is basically viable. It has at least one or two very viable lists. That being said, I totally get that within one codex, maybe some of the units shine and some of the units don't.
Sure,
Internal
absolutely.
balance on codices is not perfect and probably never will be. But
And that's okay.
by and large, for the diversity of all the factions and players, the game is actually in a really good place. There's a lot of doom and gloom and people freaking out, and that's kind of always going on. I've kind of just tuned it out. It's just constant noise. It's just the tinnitus of wargaming.
And a lot of that is, if we're being honest, that's people being selfish, right? Like the doom and gloom of, oh, my faction's not the best right now and it could be so much better, or it used to be so much better. Well, that's just you not wanting to use the tools that are in front of you, right? Or trying to relive the glory days of when I used to be on top because my faction was kind of broken at this one point. Everyone has access to the tools they need to win right now, as is. So if you're going to say that, like, my faction used to be better, or my faction this and that, none of that's true. If you're going to blame your opponent's faction of their faction is too good right now, again, the top tables at every GT for the last every week, like this year almost, has been very diverse, has been more diverse than I think I've ever seen it in this game system. So if you believe that you can't win right now, you haven't put enough games in. That's just the answer. Because you definitely can.
All right, well, thanks for watching. Or listening, rather.
Yep. See you next time.